Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Warwickshire Gardens Trust series of lectures, which previously have all gone very smoothly. I would like to welcome, in particular, Camilla Allen. Dr. Allen recently completed her PhD, which is fantastic, on the forester and conservationist Richard St. Barb Baker at the University of Sheffield. Prior to studying landscape architecture, Camilla studied illustration and worked in children's book publishing before deciding to embark on an academic career. Her research explores our relationship with trees and nature through historical studies of specific people, places, or events, which include figures like Baker, special graves like Britain's tree cathedrals, the conservation of California's coastal redwood forest, and Sheffield's commemorative street tree plantings. Camilla is currently co-editor of The Politics of Street Trees with Jan Woodstraw, which is a collected volume which will provide an interdisciplinary and international perspective on the topic of street trees, as well as developing a fellowship application to continue her research on Baker and Africa's Great Green Wall. Welcome, Dr. Allen, and apologies again. Could I ask everyone just before we start to turn off their videos and mute themselves, please? It's very important for bandwidth.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? For those, get a thumbs up if that's the case. Maybe you cannot hear me so well. Is that better? Any better? No? Oh dear. Okay, well, I'll try and speak up. Is that better? Projecting? Okay. I know these things are, I'm just going to need the, it says that the host has disabled screen sharing, so I'm just going to need that switching on, and then I'll get cracking.
Apologies, Camilla.
So
what do I need to do?
So if you go in, so in the list of participants, whoever is the host should be able to make me the host. So currently, I think if you
make host, sorry,
more, and then you can. I'm now the host. Okay, splendid.
Thank you.
Oh no, thank you. Sorry, I've been on the other end of this type of event a few times, as many of us have, so I'm aware of the particular trials and tribulations that come with navigating this kind of technology. Anyway, so bear with me. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Go full screen. Sorry, bear with me. Things are always a little bit slower. Okay. Hello. It's very nice to join you in this virtual world of conversation that we've been having for the last year. My name is Camilla Allen, and yes, as was said, I've recently finished my PhD, which is a very nice thing to have happened all from my house in the last 12 months. Lots of rather unceremonious emails with attachments saying that I've graduated and so forth. But anyway, today I'm really delighted to share my research on Britain's 3 cathedrals of trees. Just in terms of structure, I'm first going to just introduce the context. I think why it's really important for us to be talking about trees. A little about the background to my research, really to tell you a little about Richard St. Barb Baker and how that drew me onto this topic. I will contextualise a little before I get into my paper on Britain's 3 tree cathedrals. with some other examples. I think there's lots that is fascinating the minute we start to attune ourselves to this tree-like cathedral and cathedral-like tree idea that we'll be exploring today. And then I'll be sharing my paper. And I very much hope at the end of all of this we can have a conversation. So I look forward to any questions that you might have or things that were unclear. So yeah, please do make a note of anything you might like to ask me. Oh, sorry, I started right up in the middle. This is embarrassing. Sorry, bear with me, I've got 2 starter slides. Killero. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So my father sends me, they would have been paper clippings once upon a time, but they're now emails. So this morning I got an email from my father with this leader article from the Times saying, very much calling upon the government to get behind the falling number of trees in our countryside, in woodlands and in hedgerows. And one of the things that struck me is where these top-down types of policies sit, and actually how different they are to the kind of agency that we have as individuals. And I think many people are not in the position to plant huge numbers of trees. We may read about how fantastic they are to help fight climate change. We might understand how good they are for biodiversity and all of these different manifold benefits that they bring. But often these are things from which we are quite detached. And I'm struck by the balance that announcements like this have and sit in the context of ideas like this. Some of you may have been aware that the National Trust earlier this year have launched, they're calling the Blossom Rings, a blossom campaign, as a way of marking the sacrifice and loss that has occurred and really shared, so universally by people over this last year, but also to do so in such a way as creates places of meaning and beauty, celebration and communion. And I'm struck actually that one of the things that will come out of this whole very peculiar period that we've been living through are a whole sequence of special groves all across Britain. I think I've always been interested in trees, but probably not quite as much as the subject of my PhD, Richard St. Barbe Baker. From his childhood, he was very much intertwined with the idea, the importance of trees. He was born in a village called West End, which is on the outskirts of Southampton, in 1889, and he died in Saskatoon, Canada in 1982. He was in Saskatoon because he was celebrating the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Men of the Trees. He'd created the organisation in Kenya in 1922 when he was working as a colonial forestry officer. It was known then as the Watu Wamiti, and the intention was that members of that society would plant and protect trees. Had very simple, approachable sort of guidelines, and it struck a chord, and Baker was able to set up chapters all around the world. So there were Men of the Trees in Canada and in New Zealand and Britain, Australia, and many other, often some quite surprising places. I first started researching Baker in 2014. I did my master's dissertation on him. I was trying to piece together a shift that occurred in the 1950s when he had returned to Africa. But with my PhD, which I went on to undertake I started in 2015 actually, so a little while away. What I wanted to get to with the bottom there of was the fact that Baker had written a great deal about himself and a great deal about his childhood and his upbringing and his family and the home he lived in and so forth. But there was very little to critique or corroborate that. And so I had access to archival material. And so I've spent the last few years piecing together the story of this Man of the Trees, how it was that he was able to create this image of himself, this persona, which was so successful in championing the importance of trees. He went from being this very rather stern, serious-looking colonial forestry officer to, what we could consider one of the first elder statesmen of the environmental movement. He was awarded an honorary doctorate, and he was, oh, I think I might have the power to let people in. Please, just do that. Yeah, sorry, for those who've just arrived, I think I've got the power as host, so I may be jumping in and jumping out. So what, for me, was important about Baker was that he was able to communicate the impact that we had on the natural world. He did this, long before campaigns about environmental sustainability that, as we know now, really existed. But he was very keen on the people who read his books, who read the journals that the Men of the Trees produced, that they understood the impact that clear felling had on the environment, the number of trees that would be needed to fell even just a single edition of a Sunday newspaper. And sorry, losing them. One thing that Baker was very good at was being able to create a message and a story. And in the 1950s, one of his most audacious acts was to drive all the way from Trafalgar Square to Kilimanjaro with the intention of undertaking the first ecological survey of the Sahara, which I would say is probably based on quite dubious scientific practice, but one which he really saw as a mission. It was a crusade. He wanted people to understand that what happened in Africa had consequences all around the world. And he used this journey and the account of that journey as a really powerful way of sharing that with the world. This is a bit of a plug. So he made a film of this journey. It was a project which he conceived of as the Green Front. So this idea that as the Cold War was really starting to bed in Europe, that actually what was better, what would have been, what these forces would have been better placed to do, was instead to fight the desert, to combine forces and fight a humanitarian battle against resource scarcity to make sure that the most vulnerable people and places in the world were kept safe, and the world kept safer because of the lessening conflict as a result of there being more for all. And this is something that I'll be talking a little more about at a event that the Gardens Trust are putting on their New Voices series. So I'll be talking about this a little more in May. I'm just going to pause here because a couple more people have joined in, so I'll just... Sorry, to stop and start. So welcome those who've just joined. You've actually not missed anything in relation to tree cathedrals, as you'll find out. I'm just giving a bit of background to my research. The computer's got very slow. So one of the things that I've always found fascinating about Baker was his ability just to apply a very practical and ingenious way of seeing the world to quite extraordinary situations. So he was born in 1889, and after living in Canada as a young man, he studied divinity at the University of Saskatchewan between 1910 and 1913. He returned to England, and with the outbreak of war, he joined the army, and by 1917 he'd been discharged, and by 1919 he had embarked on a forestry diploma at Cambridge University. And it was whilst he was there that he had this audacious idea that all of this huge amount of timber that was left stockpiled in warehouses that had been milled for the express purpose of building aeroplanes could very well serve another purpose, and that purpose could be providing homes for people. And so alongside being one of the most innovative foresters of his generation, Baker also managed to invent the modern caravan, which is something that I often return to as one of the more peculiar footnotes in his story, but one which for me really just brings alive why he was quite distinct. I think he's often referred to as a humanitarian, and I think in seeing the necessity of making the best use of trees, timber and wood products, as well as seeing the human need, you know, young men without jobs, disabled ex-servicemen who needed an income to pay their way through university. For me, the caravan pulls a huge amount of this together. And I always end up going back to where it all started. So the first in West End, the home where Baker was born, which had a tree nursery in the back garden, it was his father's business, but also a mission hall just next door, which was also built by his father. So this idea that practical faith and practical horticulture were bound up together, and that was absolutely integral to the way in which Baker sort of just navigated the world, bringing these two together. And for me, it's something I'm kind of mindful of, is this sort of practical understanding of trees. And, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, fighting climate change, you know, great for our mental health. We use tree products in all kinds of interesting ways, but at the same time, they're also they allow us to transcend our everyday lives. And I think for me, this quote from one of Baker's children's books really sums up why he is particularly magical. This idea that we can seek and find the redemptive in trees, and just by planting them. This is very much in the context of a mission being given to the hero of the book, Camilla. This idea that just through planting trees, the tired earth will live again and become a garden and a paradise. And just again, I'm going to open the. So Baker has been the main subject of my research for some time, but what has also been diverting are many of the things that I've come across on my way. Baker had wide-ranging interests, and they had a fantastic journal, which actually is one of the longest running environmental journals in the world. So in 1936, the journal Trees was published, and in the first edition of the journal, I came across this extraordinary picture of a cathedral of trees laid out in Scotland, and I had lots of other things that I was meant to be doing, but I posted this on Twitter to see if I could track anything down. I really did get quite sleuth-like. I was combing Google Earth satellite images to see if I could find any kind of cruciform patterns in forests on the outskirts of Oban. And it ended up being about 6 months after I'd originally posted this that the great-granddaughter of the man who planted Britain's first tree cathedral got in touch, which was rather a treat. And I think the next few slides will just share with you some of these ideas of these sort of tree-like cathedrals and cathedral-like trees, because I think since studying landscape architecture, I've been rather intrigued by this, what it is we choose to see and what it is we choose to create. And so this will be taking you rather on a journey of the sublime through to the kitsch, really. I hope you'll enjoy it. This image was sent by my co-editor Jan very recently, an image of the trunks of trees, beech trees I think in particular, forming the nave of a cathedral. I've just recently read Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth. There's a bit of light relief from all the academic stuff I've been reading. And I find it fascinating, you know, how we try and understand the world through seeing these connections between architecture and the natural environment. This idea that we have been able to replicate in some way the beauty of a cathedral using trees, and that we've been able to use trees to in some way recreate the beauty of a cathedral. There are lots of really wonderful examples. I mean, the Ash Dome by David Nash, a space that sadly has been affected by ash dieback, I think. If I do ever get to see it, I do hope I get to see it whilst it's still in leaf. A chapel in Japan which uses these dendric forms to create an architectural interior. An extraordinarily eccentric little chapel in France, Le Chêne Chapelle, the Chapel Oak, in which there are two chapels, one on ground level and one higher up. A rather traumatized looking tree, actually, I have to say. And what I love about this as a subject are all of these rather peculiar people that you come across. So a group in Germany called Sanftstrukturen, soft structures, who make these buildings out of willow, bent and twisted willow. And I was clear in the description of this talk that I'll be telling you more about Britain's 3 tree cathedrals. And the disclaimer is we don't have the monopoly on them. There are tree cathedrals elsewhere, although I'd like to say I'm not quite sure that they're quite as, they don't quite meet the same criteria. So this is one in Italy that was created by an artist. There were 2, one in Orobi and one in Trento. And sadly, the one in Trento was destroyed in the last few years by a thunderstorm and isn't being replanted. But I do wonder, given the fact that the structure is not created by trees, it's a structure within which trees were grown, if actually the trees were rather imperiled from the start. And this fantastic place that I've just discovered, the Tree Church in Ohapu, New Zealand, which I think is about one of the most whimsical places I've ever seen. It's like a childhood's fantasy made real. And in the Netherlands, a land of very tall people, they make very tall tree cathedrals, but this is using poplars. It's quite close to Amsterdam, in a polder called Almere, and I've yet to visit. COVID's really put a dampener on tree cathedral visiting this year, but they all give, I think, rather interesting context to, I think, what is this sort of quite perennial idea that we see around us, these sort of architectonic forms, and they often lift our spirit in quite interesting and intriguing ways. But anyway, that's the more chatty bit, and I'd now like to share with you my paper, which is on Britain's 3 cathedrals of trees, and which explores them in this, through this idea that they take this allegorical form but then transcend it and have tried to turn it into architecture. The trees were here before us. They outlive us, are ascribed wisdom beyond our human capacity, and we can only guess at how magic and meaning came to be intertwined with them through time, from the trees of life and knowledge to emblematic liberty trees during the French Revolution and the ubiquitous but essential street tree. Our relationship with them offers up a wealth of interest, but the focus of this paper does not lie in an exploration of allegory in relation to trees, but how that allegory has been transformed in 3 different iterations into architecture, the story of Britain's 3 cathedrals of trees. Historians have long pondered the question of whether the forests produced architecture or whether architecture plundered the forest for its forms. Marc-Antoine Logier developed the theory that the earliest buildings had been constructed within the living trunks and boughs of trees, and Salomon de Caus enlivened the columns of the Hortus Palatinus in Heidelberg with sprouting trunk-like decoration. The debt we have to dendric forms in our built environment today is manifest in projects like King's Cross Station and Singapore's Gardens in the Bay. Simon Sharma and Robert Pogue Harrison both posit the woodland origins and use of built sacred spaces, with, in Pogue Harrison's mind, the columns being in temples being analogous, but the cluster of trunks in a sacred grove, and in Sharma's as descriptive of attention within the early Christian church as it attempted to distance itself from pagan nature worship. The concept of groups of trees being church-like and churches being tree-like manifests in different ways in recent history. A cluster of 9 redwoods form the cathedral tree in California. There is a cathedral grove on Vancouver Island, and the closing motif in the Disney film Fantasia is that of a procession through a forest where the branches of the trees form perfect Gothic arches. The author John Stuart Collis described the peace and the mystery, the soft encircling silence of the glades, the holy calm within the vaulted tree-walled path. These we find again when we enter the Gothic church and pace the aisles therein and gaze upon the fretted branches of the roof. Alexander Pope had the practical idea of actually creating a cathedral using trees. Recorded in Joseph Spence's Observations, Anecdotes and Characters of Books and Men, 1820, he declared, "I have sometimes had an idea of planting an old Gothic cathedral, or rather some old Roman temple, in trees. Good large poplars, with their white stems cleared of boughs to a proper height, would serve very well for the columns, and might form the different aisles." He also used the allegorical form in his poem The Garden, which describes trees forming the pillared nave of a cathedral. Yet, despite Pope's specifications, when Spence went on to create a grove along similar lines in his garden at Byfleet, he decided against formal symmetry and instead created a space that alluded to an ecclesiastical form without imitating its exact geometry. Reconciling the theory of architecture with practical arboriculture, however, was very much on the mind of Sir James Hall, geologist, president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and author of Essay on the Origins, History and Principles of Gothic Architecture. In the essay, Hall sought to demonstrate the artisanal beginnings of this mode of construction, and was so convinced of his theory that he sought to bring the form to life, creating his own living experiments, which would prove that the vaulted ceilings, arches and windows of the churches of the Middle Ages were a direct facsimile of nature. The illustration that begins his essay shows the scale of building he was able to achieve using living ash and willow, with it being more like a quaint Wendy house than an imposing Gothic cathedral. But he was satisfied enough to declare that the appearance of the whole, whether seen from within or from without, bears, I flatter myself, no small resemblance to a cathedral. As you might notice, to the left, you can see the separate spire. He wasn't able to plant the whole thing using just the trees that he had. There is a wealth of spiritual and sylvan incident and allegory to be found in the biography of Richard St. Barbe Baker, founder of the Men of the Trees and the subject of my PhD. Baker's childhood alone yields a spiritual awakening in the woods, and later in his career he sought to establish a sacred grove in the coast redwood forests of California. The Journal of the Men of the Trees, published from 1936, is replete with proclamations of tree plantings for all manner of occasions, including shield-shaped formations for the abortive coronation of Edward VIII. And alongside the more prosaic activities of the Society was a reference to a project in Scotland where one member had felt compelled to plant trees in the form of a cathedral, creating a sylvan church, the wonder and admiration of everyone who sees it. Scotland's Cathedral of Trees was created by the businessman Alexander Mackay in 1921 on his estate to the east of Oban. As well as building a mansion, he also financed a golf course, and on the grass and heathland of his estate, he participated in the afforestation efforts, which were popular at the time as a means of preventing a timber shortage like that which had been experienced during the Great War. Mackay decided to have the Cathedral of Trees laid out on a schematic based on the old cathedral in St Andrews, itself a ruin. A photo from 1926 shows the tree cathedral in its first decade, constructed with heathers, clipped yews and beech, with standard lime trees along the external wall line. Later, the assertion that Glencruiton was intended as a memorial to the Great War has been made, but there are no formal elements within the cathedral that suggest it was such. Instead, it is the resting place of Alexander Mackay and his wife, as well as other members of the family. The Mackays are interred in front of the east window, an architectural form aped through the use of red-leaved aces in a cruciform pattern, which carpet the floor with crimson when their leaves fall in autumn. That it fell out of use and knowledge is again reflected in the journal, with a letter written by one member in the spring of 1956 to ask if anyone could help her identify the mysterious Cathedral of Trees. And the decline of the cathedral is illustrated by the reply from another member of the society, who recounted that 10 years previously she had visited the cathedral and had sent information about it to the journal, which had resulted in someone attempting to photograph the site, but who had found it impossible to take a view. Further inquiries had revealed that it had been closed for some time, owing to the fact that there were not enough funds to keep it up, and it didn't seem that there was any chance of it being reopened, at least not in the near future. There is no evidence to suggest that many people were aware of Alexander Mackay's activities in Scotland, but the significance of trees as fellow casualties of war was not lost on the artist John Nash. Nash, whilst serving in the trenches, had recorded the brutality of the Western Front in paintings which often lacked human casualties, but instead focused on the twisted mass of German planes or the shattered trunks of branchless trees. He returned to England after the war and created numerous landscape studies, of which groups of trees took centre stage, finding an eerie peace in the British countryside. And around 1930, both Nash and an accountant, E.K. Blythe, were inspired by groups of trees. In Nash's case, it was to paint Wood on the Downs, based on Ivinghoe Beacon in the Chiltern Hills, Buckinghamshire, and for Blythe, it was to create a living cathedral. The Cathedral of Trees in Whipsnade is unambiguously a memorial to those lost in the Great War. Edmund Blythe had served and lost 2 friends during the conflict, and it was upon the death of a third in 1930 that he was inspired to create an ambitious structure, in part prompted by a visit to the Liverpool Anglican Cathedral and the beauty of watching the sun set behind a copse of trees. The cathedral itself is just 10 miles away from the trees on the Ivanhoe Beacon, which offers the very real possibility that it was the same stand of beech trees which inspired both works. The chancel and nave are 140 yards long and are planted with lime, chestnut and tulip trees, replacing those which were lost to Dutch elm disease, and with different chapels for different seasons. It is now Grade 2 listed, with Historic England recognising it as a highly unusual memorial landscape, based upon a conceptual rather than a literal design. Unlike Glencruiton, it does not follow a specific schematic, but was intended to be cathedral-like, and in Blythe's words, although it contains beautiful areas, that is not its primary significance, and nor is it a garden. It is managed to emphasise the vigour and balance of individual plants in patterns that create an enclosure for worship and meditation, offering heightened awareness of God's presence and transcendence. The third Cathedral of Trees is in Newlands, Milton Keynes, and was designed by the landscape architect Neil Higson in 1986. Higson had been commissioned to bring 2 ambitions to life for Milton Keynes. First, that it was to eventually become a city, and that as a city it would be known as the City of Trees. These points are important because the municipal context of the Newlands Tree Cathedral does give it a significant role in the town, much as a stone-built cathedral does in a city, as the centre of a diocese and indicative of a thriving economy and population. Higson recalled that although he never visited the nearby Tree Cathedral in Whipsnade, driving past it was what inspired him to create one for Milton Keynes. And so, in taking only the idea of the form, Higson developed a plan for Newlands based on the outline of Norwich Cathedral. Along with the Tree Cathedral, Higson was also responsible for the creation of a turf maze based upon one of the oldest in Britain, in Saffron Walden in Essex. These spiritual and magical elements were part of what Higson felt was his brief to make the much publicised image of Milton Keynes as the beautiful city believable and real, for you to look around and believe. But how does this idea of a magical or symbolic landscape relate back to Glen Cruton, and from there to the United States, and before that, the ideas and theories of Enlightenment? Much as Alexander Pope's poetry harks back to an Arcadian idyll, there have been other movements which lionize past ages. In the late 19th century, two Americans claimed to have been initiated into the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, a secret fraternity dating back to the 16th century, and which was in turn informed by Hermetic, alchemic, and occult doctrines. They went on to form esoteric Protestant organizations based in the United States, known now as the Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis. There is much which is diverting and distracting about their presence in this study, but the fact that one of the Cathedrals of Trees was created by a member of this group gives its inclusion credence. That one of the oldest images associated with the organisation is that of a mobile temple, and the profusion of nature-based imagery in Rosicrucian artefacts in a small way demonstrates their interest in unusual places of worship, the iconography of the red rose, and more unusual images like that of the tree of Pansophia and the vaulted roof in a set of occult tarot cards held at the British Museum. In 1937, the Ancient Mystical Order Rosicrucis reported the death of one of its brethren, Alexander Mackay, and described what he, as one good brother, had been inspired by the Great White Brotherhood to do to represent the spirit of the Cathedral of the Soul on earth. The article in the Rosicrucian Digest describes Mackay as having spent his life's savings to give to future posterity something that would symbolise the spirituality of the soul in meditation, the principles of universal brotherhood and love, and the symbolism of the cross. That Mackay was a member of the Brotherhood is no great surprise, as my research on Richard St. Barbe Baker has resulted in some interesting international connections, often through eugenicists, through California's Bohemian Grove. Mackay had been described by the Times in his obituary as having amassed a huge personal fortune, and he had been prominent in American business life for over half a century, someone really to know. And it is upon this theme that the three cathedrals of Milton Keynes and Glen Cruton connect. The Tree Cathedral, of Milton Keynes and Glen Cruton connect, not through some great occult conspiracy, but through a form which was used to bring meaning and magic to the land, that of the labyrinth. The turf maze in Saffron Walden is often referred to as being Rosicrucian, not because of its association with secret societies, but as a result of having been laid out in the period between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when alchemic, hermetic, and herbal gardens were being created across Europe, and the Protestant communities of the North were seeking to imbue their culture with a richness of allegory. And, much like the three tree cathedrals, the mazes are on open land, accessible to all, providing space for ritual, contemplation, and recreation, in the same way that the living temples of this study make provision for reflection and spiritual communion. That the first and last tree cathedrals have this Rosicrucian link may be coincidental, yet it does serve to illustrate the deep tradition that these sylvan temples are a part of, one in which meaning, memorial, and magic are intertwined, where the compulsion to bring the idea to life using living materials supersedes the eccentricity of the form. That there is no direct connection between the three cathedrals suggests that the inspiration and energy necessary to manifest in root, trunk, and branch a form of such beauty and significance is a perennial dream, manifest in different ways in different times. All three share similarities and ambiguities. All three are open throughout the year to anyone who would wish to visit. Only one is formally part of a park, 2 are places of interment, 2 are war memorials, and they all use trees as the primary material. They are manifestations of unusual creative vision and are evidence of the potential that tree planting has to create places of rest, beauty, and meditation. There are no bishops, no doors, and the windows are unglazed. The seasons replace sermons, and in these three cathedrals we find an enduring expression of faith in nature. And so I'm going to end there, just with this, actually with a quote from something completely different, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Lake District farmer, James Rebanks, and his recent book, English Pastoral. But it closes with a beautiful description of his motivation in planting trees around his land in the more remote part of the Lake District. And I think for me, this is what I find so important about thinking really clearly about our relationship with trees and the way in which we use them and the way in which we use them to plant meaning. Because it does, as he says, if you've done it well, it will outlast you and leave the world a little richer and more beautiful because of your efforts. Anyway, I will stop there. And if anyone has got any comments or questions, I would be more than happy to hear from you.
Thank you very much indeed, Camilla. That was really interesting, and I share your passion for trees and the natural world. So, I saw there were a couple of questions, if I can find them. Did Baker, I presume this, did he collaborate with Wangari Maathai? If that's the right pronunciation, I have no idea.
Yes, interestingly, they did meet. Baker returned after his return to Kenya in the 50s. He went back quite frequently, and so they met in the 1970s, which was an event that he recorded in some of his circular letters. He'd really stopped writing so much at that point, and in her autobiographies, she describes meeting him. And that in itself is something that I'm looking to explore, is how Baker both sort of seeded some of these ideas of the Green Front and the Green Belt movement, but which were also their ideas that appear in large-scale planning all around the world. So it's piecing that together and understanding how these certain figures then push these ideas further. I think she was an extraordinary advocate for trees. I think a great successor to him. Shall I do? Are the questions in the chat? Should I have a?
Yeah, I can't see any more. I don't know whether.
Is there a question about what the definition is of a cathedral of trees, as opposed to just another? Oh, sorry. Was I terribly quiet the whole way through? Apologies. I don't think I've got the most. This is one of the, in terms of the technical setup, I haven't got great microphone. And I mean,
there were lots of people involved in forestry in the 1920s and 1930s, lots of landowners. Why did it go out of fashion? Or was it just events like the war and lack of money? Or
I think forestry has always been a challenging I think one of the best quotes that I came across describing the creation of the Forestry Commission at the end of the First World War was it was a solution looking for a problem. So there were lots of people who were very keen on the idea of forestry, and the timber shortages of the First World War, when a huge amount of timber, which was being at that stage one of the biggest uses of timber, were pit props. So the mining of coal, particularly in Wales, necessitated a huge amount of timber, which was for the most part imported from France and from the Baltic. And so when that trade ended, was held up during the First World War, suddenly there was this realization that British forestry was not able to fill the gap. And so the argument was made that for Britain to be self-sufficient, there needed to be a domestic forestry policy that closed that gap. But what was, I think, a challenge from that point onwards was it was also bound up with a very clear sort of idea that this was going to provide jobs, it was going to provide livelihoods, for the men who'd fought in the wars. They'd have the option of be able to be outside and, restoring the earth. And actually, planting trees is very, it's not the kind of thing that you often see the benefit of in terms of monetary return. And a lot of forestry programs have been really stymied by that. The jobs dry up, they're not really skilled, they don't go anywhere. And so there's a disconnect between the two. So yeah, that in some way answers that. There's also
yes, I suppose a friend of mine grew a lot of poplars, or inherited lots of poplars because for matches, but of course the big lighter put paid to that.
Yeah.
So he's just had them cut down and had to pay quite a lot of money, far less than he got from the timber.
It's a gamble. I think
yes.
it's not often, it's not often considered in those terms, but I think.
Dr. Jakes says that Viollet-le-Duc is worth reading for his series on the origins of Gothic architecture. I'm sure that's right. Yes, I was interested in your comment about Pope because, of course, the avenue at Stowe was his cathedral of white poplars, but unfortunately, it was removed by Capely Brown.
I think one of the
Sorry, Rosemary, can I ask you to turn mute yourself, please, or thank you. Sorry, Camilla.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that, so when I presented this paper at the Gardens Trust New Research Symposium, and the gentleman who'd been there, he was the head of gardens at the National Trust, I was asked what the best way to manage a tree cathedral was, and I'm not, I can't speak with authority as a manager of trees, but it was the best heckle I've ever had. He just said, cut them down and start again. Because essentially they do present this real problem that they do, they can over mature. There's a real balancing act. It's like a composition that when you're using living material, knowing how it will mature, how that will reach a kind of crescendo, but then also what happens beyond that point, recognizing the fallibility, the mortality of the material that you're using.
And it relied, I suppose, on pleaching up the trunk so much, and that was the antithesis of the new natural demand for nature, I suppose. So they quickly went out of fashion. I was just amazed that they came back, really, in the 20th century, irreligious society. But, no.
And Viollet-le-Duc.
Yeah. Has anyone else got any
questions? It's Paul. Could I ask Camilla, can you tell us a little bit about Baker's proposed green wall in North Africa? Did it ever get started? What If it did, what happened to it?
Well, yes. So when Baker, I'm trying to think of the best, give them a very shortest intro to this. So he was, the end of the Second World War really marked the point at which he became very clearly a pacifist. So this idea that planting trees was a necessary alternative to the militarization that he saw going on around the world. I mean, he'd fought and participated in the First World War. He claimed to have initiated the Home Guard in Britain in the Second World War. So he was a man of audacious claims. But in the 1950s, he really sort of he joined up with some other quite interesting people and interesting thinkers who were looking at promoting these ideas. So in Canada, in North America, there'd been a tree planting project to plant a shelter belt from the Panhandle in Texas all the way to the Canadian border, which was a means of stopping the dust storms that had been created by the Dust Bowl. And that kind of idea of continental scale planting was something that he was, very much convinced was possible and plausible. It just had to be invested in properly. And so when he was getting money together to do this, to undertake this journey, so traveling all the way from London to Kilimanjaro, that was with the intention of promoting this idea of the Green Front, that all the countries of the world would band together and commit to planting trees, and that would be his way of bringing about world peace. And it's, to read any of his books at that period is to be confronted by this extraordinary level of optimism. And my own, I mean, the first time I read his children's book, Committee, that I mentioned earlier, I was just struck by the sort of cynicism that he, was able to create this image of a world full of earth healers when actually, most people are quite happy, I don't know, just watching the telly. And so during his lifetime, very little happened. He was promoting the idea of a University of the Sahara in Morocco, and a woman called Wendy Campbell Purdy went out and in a place called Bou Saada in Algeria started planting trees. So working on models which actually nowadays you really would see as being sort of small to medium scale agroforestry or permaculture. So just ideas that by planting trees of the right species, you can slowly restore the microclimate, and that then has a knock-on effect. And I recently came across a chap called Thomas Crowther, who's, I think, a very interesting new man. He's an ecologist and based in a lab, very sort of snazzy lab in Switzerland, who's come out with lots of very big claims about how many trees need to be planted for us to arrest the advance of climate change, and has really had a lot of kickback because essentially it's quite often quite naive proposals that involve the same problematic aspects of plans like large-scale afforestation. You're displacing people, you're changing people's ways of life. The nomadic farmers aren't considered. The tree species is absolutely essential. The rates of success are incredibly small for planting trees in arid land. So it's always been really problematic, but it has still perpetuated. So the Green Front has never taken place as is, but there is a project now called Africa's Great Green Wall, which was first promoted by the African Union in 2007, and they started planting in 2014. So it exists, but it isn't actually still something that even, I went to Kenya and Ethiopia a few years ago, and it's a project that many people haven't even heard of. So it gets huge amounts of international funding, but is still actually rather enigmatic on the ground. Yet there's the intention that it will be seen from space. So that's what I really want to get to with my sort of next bit of research is just to sort of pin down this myth that has been perpetuated by people like Baker, and is currently, huge amounts of money being spent on it, but is it real? Well, sort of, I wonder.
Sheffield, obviously you're presumably involved in the battle with the council. Did you win in the end, or I can't remember what happened?
I would say, well, I wouldn't say that I was one of the tree warriors.
No.
I think I realised early on that I was either going to be able to write my PhD, or I was going to fall down a terrible Facebook amateur anthropological rabbit hole. To live in a city where there's so much tension, that social media, newspapers, everything just was alive with this incredibly challenging discourse between the council and the protesters. And in the end, what happened was so this was all due to the fact that the council had signed a 25-year contract for the roads to be resurfaced, essentially, by a big multinational. And there were lots of ways in which the contract just did not take into consideration the long-term care and maintenance of trees. So things like the curbs had to be replaced straight, and actually, as trees have slowly pushed the curbstones away, the only alternative was to replace this curbstone straight. All of the roots would have to be cut. The tree then, would be probably suffering some kind of long-term rot and falling on someone's car in a few years' time. So the decision was that any tree that was likely to be affected by roadworks, and they essentially were using something like it was quite extraordinary, like a cheese grater, just to take off the surface of the roads, and any roots that would have been coming up would have been got. And then re-tarmacking that the best thing to do was any trees that could be affected by that would just be cut down. So there was a caveat within the contract that allowed the contractors to do that, but the council refused to admit that that's what they'd signed to all the protesters, who knew that that was really what was at the bottom of it. So in the end, through an extraordinary campaign, the tree campaigners did win out, and I think things are sort of much more sense prevails. There's now a working strategy for street trees in Sheffield, which is fantastic. So the council working together with Sheffield Tree Action Group and the Woodland Trust and the Wildlife Trusts, they've all come together to actually write a policy. And actually what is fantastic, the book that I'm editing with Jan brings together lots of different contributions. So we've got, it started off very much in Sheffield, so we held a conference in the Department of Landscape Architecture with the intention of bringing together, and we had contributions from lawyers and economists and professors of English language talking about meaning, and historians talking about the narratives that have really promoted the planting of street trees for different ends. And all together, I think this I feel is my contribution really to the street tree crisis. So although I wasn't up a tree dressed as a bird or whatever it was, fighting a good fight, I think the book hopefully will make a contribution to our understanding of actually what, the very difficult position that local authorities are often in, where trees are planted, but they then face all of the legal liability for anything that happens, subsidence, people tripping over the roots if they're nudging the pavement, they're paying for the leaves to be swept up. And so, it's going to be very interesting to pull together the different arguments that are made as to how we can have this, how we can maybe bring into being this future where there are more trees and we're addressing climate change in all the ways that we're told by scientists we need to do, but in such a way as actually is sustainable, that is meaningful and is, robust, rather than this idea that we could just have a big target and we just won't worry about the trees further down the line. It's about meeting those initial goals.
Thank you. When's the book out? Do you think?
Hopefully May 2022. So
okay.
we're getting the first and second drafts at the moment. So
Fascinating. Good. If anyone else has any questions, please would they unmute? And if not, would everyone unmute to thank Dr. Allen for a really fascinating lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, sorry, and it's always one of the odd things at the letting people in.
Yes.
That's probably people off a little. Oh yeah, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
No, and I do again apologise to you and everyone else, all the 10 people still here, that for the slight balls up earlier. I don't know what's happened, but anyway, I'm sure.
Well, these things happen.
Yeah, but anyway, so thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Cheers. Thank you.
So somebody's saying they're going to visit Glen Crucian. Okay, lovely.
Ah, wonderful. Yes, I do. And it's on the map now. It's easy to find, and it is you can find it on Google Maps. It's now listed. There's a nice little website, and they've been doing a whole lot of work, so felling lots of trees around it and doing a lot of work draining it, because it was pretty boggy when I did visit. So yeah.
Well, and what trees was it planted with? Because it's one of the problems with planting in Scotland, that they tended to plant the wrong things, didn't they?
Well, they planted. It was mostly yew and heather, so it was much more of it. It was much less intended to create the sort of the arched nave that was very successful in Newlands, actually.
More in plan.
The idea is it's much more in keeping with the ruin that it was modelled on. But then all around it was a huge forest plantation. So as those trees grew up, the flat valley that the tree cathedral was planted in just became inundated with water, totally overshadowed by all these huge trees.
Okay.
And it was just like a beautiful, beautiful bog when I went to visit. Lots of sort of very waterlogged, ill-looking plants. So yeah.
Oh dear.
But kind of magical.
Yeah. So who's running it? The National Trust for Scotland? Or?
No, it's the family of Alexander Mackay, his granddaughter and his great-granddaughter. They've taken it upon themselves. They've also, interestingly, so I met a woman called Harriet, who was Alexander Mackay's great-granddaughter, and her brother was very keen on turning elements of it into more of a woodland burial site, because it does have this. It could have much more use. I think bringing it back and consecrating it means it could become workable as almost a sort of business.
Okay. Yeah.
It's rather interesting. But yeah, I need to get back up there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. You deserve a glass of wine or something. So
yeah,
I've already started. So.
Perfect. Well, enjoy.
Good.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, I will say goodbye. Thank you very much. And to everyone else, I will close the meeting.
Thank you.